Motion for debate, government policy towards China. Lord Alton of Liverpool.
My Lords, in opening this last debate of the year, which will focus on human rights and security issues arising from China's actions in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Xinjiang, Tibet and the South China Sea, may I begin by thanking everyone who will speak in the debate, along with the House of Lords Library for its excellent briefing note and the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China for its critical role and for its support and assistance. I declare interest as an officer of the all-party groups on Hong Kong, the Uyghurs and freedom of religion or belief, and as a patron of Hong Kong Watch. I also note, my Lords, that today has symbolic significance because on this day, 40 years ago, the Sino-British Treaty was signed by Margaret Thatcher and Zhao Ziyang. My Lords, China's human rights violations and the growing security challenges posed by Beijing's international posture are well documented and will raise profound questions about our principles, security and strategic resilience during the course of this debate. And in this week of all weeks, we've seen more evidence of the threats to our domestic security and institutions. Commenting on the activities of the 40,000 agents of the United Front Work Department, our Intelligence and Security Committee says the UFWD has penetrated, I quote, every sector of the United Kingdom economy. MI5's head, Ken McCallum, says infiltration is on an epic scale. Extraordinary, then, in those circumstances for the Prime Minister to be pressing for closer ties with the Chinese Communist Party regime and to say we should no longer describe it as a threat. Now, my Lords, this may not be Maclean and Burgess, Philby and Blunt, but subversion of our state and its institutions involves manipulation and entrapment, influencing and cyber attacks, intimidation, threats and transnational repression. Not long ago, the Foreign Secretary wanted this regime prosecuted for genocide. So in setting the scene for the debate today, let me begin perhaps in Hong Kong. In 2019, it was a privilege to be one of the international team which monitored the last fair and free election in a city that was once a bastion of freedom in Asia. Since 2020 and the enactment of the draconian national security law, it has subsequently seen every vestige of democracy dismantled. The consequences are stark. Over 1,200 political prisoners languish in jails, including prominent figures like the British citizen Jimmy Lai, exiled legislators such as Nathan Law, facing bounties placed on their heads simply for advocating democracy. Recent Human Rights Watch analysis has highlighted increasing transnational repression aimed at British national overseas BNO passport holders and their families, and even to non-Hong Kong residents, threatening critics abroad with extradition. Recalling the attacks on protesters outside the Manchester consulate, which the Foreign Affairs Select Committee described as a brazen violation of diplomatic norms, we can see where this has taken us. In a letter to the Security Minister, I recently requested a dedicated email address to be set up so that victims of CCP overseas intimidation could guarantee getting through to someone adequately trained in this very specialised crime. And perhaps the noble Baroness, the Minister, when she comes to reply, could say when a response might be forthcoming and also say a word to those UK Hong Kongers still denied access to mandatory provident funds, an estimated £3 billion. What progress has the government made in securing the release of this money, and what does she have to say about the role of HSBC and Standard Charter? I wonder, my Lords, did the Minister raise this matter when she, I'm talking now about Minister West, recently visited Hong Kong, and if so, what response did she receive? I'll also, if I may, take the opportunity to say a word or two more about Jimmy Lai, although I know that the noble Lord Garnier and others will do so as well. Mr. Lai is currently on the stand being asked spurious questions about his involvement with British nationals, including people that he never met or even heard of. The United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention found multiple violations of his freedom. For a British national who has never held a Chinese passport to be held in solitary confinement with no consular access denied access to the sacraments, dragged out to court to respond to an entirely fabricated narrative, is simply outrageous, and it certainly makes a mockery of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. May I ask the Minister if she'll support the request by British nationals who've been cited during the proceedings in the case to be heard in the Hong Kong court, in which she also placed on record her view of the absurdity of this show trial, the spurious charade of dragging foreign legislators into it as well. Could she also roundly condemn the recent jailing of 45 Hong Kong pro-democracy leaders, including Joshua Wong and Benny Tai, sentenced to years in jail for so-called subversion? Shocking. But let me turn then also to the atrocities in Xinjiang and Tibet. In Tibet, the CCP continues its campaign of cultural erasure. There are systematic efforts to suppress Tibetan language, dismantle monasteries and impose Sinicization policies. The Dalai Lama remains exiled and religious freedoms are virtually non-existent. Freedom House has ranked Tibet amongst the least free regions in the world, highlighting the CCP's use of surveillance, mass arrests and propaganda to suppress Tibetan identity. Tibet's plight and world silence is mirrored by the persecution of China's religious believers, people like the young woman Zhang Zan, a journalist jailed in Wuhan for seeking the truth about the origins of COVID. And note the atrocities against Falun Gong practitioners and the industrial-scale repression of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. Over 1 million have been detained in camps, subjected to forced labour, indoctrinization, even sterilisation. The United Nations Human Rights Office has described potential crimes against humanity, while the House of Commons, together with 11 other global parliaments and the United States government, called it by its proper name, genocide. And by virtue of the CCP's intentional aim to prevent births of Uyghurs through forced sterilisation, it certainly meets the criteria set out in the 1948 Convention on the Crime of Genocide. Canada has just sanctioned Cheng Guangzhou and Erkin Tuniaz, two key officials responsible for Xinjiang atrocities. The UK failed to do so in 2021, and I wonder if we'll do so now. And what about Uyghur forced labour embedded in global supply chains? The House will have seen reports about this in the Financial Times and on BBC Panorama. I've been raising this during the proceedings on the energy bill, and we'll have more to say in due course about it. But I name again Canadian Solar, a huge beneficiary, and ask how precisely does the government intend to root out slavery in the renewable industry? Will she take this opportunity to reiterate the Business Secretary's clear statement that he, his words, absolutely expects there to be no slavery in any part of the supply chain? How is that commitment going to be honoured? What are we going to do to prioritise supply chain resilience by diversifying imports and supporting domestic industries? And my lords, in the light of breaches of the 2015 Modern Slavery Act and the Proceeds of Crime Act, I'm glad that the Joint Committee on Human Rights will make this the subject of an in-depth inquiry in the new year. And I wonder, to help that inquiry, if a noble Baroness, the Minister, will ask for an audit of dependency on authoritarian regimes across UK critical infrastructure. Can she update the House on whether Project Defend, which was supposed to build UK resilience, has been entirely dropped? And with a trade deficit of over £23.7 billion with China, and British workers losing their jobs in the car industry undercut by slave labour, this immoral trade is also a threat to our economy and our security, undercutting resilience, deepening dependency, points often made by the noble Lord Blencathra and the noble Lord Purvis, from whom we'll hear later. And that leads me, my lords, to Taiwan and the South China Sea. In May, with my noble friend Baroness de Souza and the noble Lord Rogan, we attended the inauguration of President Lai in the vibrant democracy of Taiwan, home to 23 million free people. Taiwan's Ministry of Defence reported over 1,700 military incursions into its airspace in 2023 alone, a 40% increase from the previous year. And meanwhile, as noted in Jane's Defence Weekly, Beijing continues to hold large-scale military drills around the world. A conflict over Taiwan would be catastrophic, with consequences extending far beyond the region. A recent Bloomberg report estimated that a war over Taiwan could shave $10 trillion from the global economy. That's 5 times worse than even the impact of the horrific war in Ukraine has been. As Taiwan produces over 60% of the world's semiconductors and 90% of advanced chips, the disruption to supply chains would be unparalleled. And without these chips, of course, nothing works. Our critical infrastructure depends upon them. The devices in our pockets can't run without them. My Lord, has the government assessed the UK's economic exposure to various scenarios in the Taiwan Strait? And will that be part of the China audit? And our headaches in the South China Sea don't end there. With China's militarization of artificial islands in defiance of the 2016 ruling by the Permanent Court of Arbitration, undermining international maritime law, we must recognise these changed circumstances and deepen military and economic ties with Taiwan, expand freedom of navigation and operations, and further bolster alliances with like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific, including Japan, Australia and ASEAN nations. AUKUS, of course, is a promising step in that direction, but we must commit further resources and political will. We should support Taiwan's accession to the CPTPP. We must also be far more aware of China's military heft. Note the support China has given Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It has provided Moscow with dual-use technology, expanded trade in sanctioned goods, and offered diplomatic cover in multilateral forums. President Zelensky's own advisor says China provides over 60% of the components used to prosecute Putin's illegal war. That's without the supply of weaponized drones in violation of sanctions. A deadly quartet, now led by China, poses a direct challenge to the rules-based international order. As the European Council on Foreign Relations notes, the Sino-Russian alignment extends beyond Ukraine. It is aiming to reshape global norms in their favour. My Lords, Russia's war is China's war. The CCP knows that depleted war chests make it harder to deter escalation over Taiwan. Meanwhile, China is engaged in what the former Foreign Secretary called the biggest military build-up in history. I've sent the Noble Baroness, the Minister, Lord Coker and Sir Julian Lewis MP a disturbing report given to me alleging an illicit bioweapons programme, along with a separate note on imagination technologies and China reform, which has deep connections to China's military-industrial complex and national security establishment. And I hope the Noble Baroness will promise a full written reply in due course. What is clear enough is that this is a hostile state. It is ludicrous and worse to try and justify deepening business links, pouring public and private money into China's coffers while they are making possible an illegal war in Europe. And this is also, of course, an enemy within. Chinese companies dominate critical infrastructure sectors, from energy to technology, and I know we'll hear from the Noble Lord Fox on this, including, my lords, the millions of China-made surveillance cameras right across Britain. Russi speculates that over 80% of foreign direct investment into the UK from China comes from Chinese state-owned enterprises, heavily subsidised companies operating under the direction of a one-party state. And universities too are entangled in partnerships with Chinese institutions linked to the People's Liberation Army. Note the examples in the 2023 Civitas report, including work on artificial intelligence and quantum computing. Perhaps the Minister can tell us what we're doing to assist universities to become less resilient on CCP money, and what we did to challenge UCL, an illustrious university, when Professor Michelle Shipworth was removed from teaching a course on China, saying it conflicted with the university's commercial interests. Professor Shipworth had highlighted data from the Global Slavery Index suggesting China had the second highest prevalence of modern slavery in the world. Such examples, and this debate, underlines what our International Relations and Defence Committee of this House said was the need for a coherent strategy, filling what was referred to as a strategic void. How will the China audit attempt to fill that void? And how will it connect to Lord Robertson's strategic defence review? To conclude, a coherent strategy would face the multifaceted challenges posed by China, strengthening our alliances, protecting national security, reducing economic dependencies, exposing authoritarian collaboration. We ought not to be persuaded by those who seek to talk down Britain. making out that we have no international clout. Capitulating now would cause greater pain later. By aligning our policies with our principles, we can safeguard our security, support those who suffer under oppression, and lead by example in defending democracy on the global stage. My Lords, I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
My Lords, I want to begin by thanking the noble Lord Alton for securing this debate and for all that he said in his opening remarks. His speech was a devastating analysis of the real world. And if this government and if this House fail to pay attention to what he has said, well, then we are doing ourselves and our fellow countrymen a disservice. This important debate is timely, and I hope it will be influential in shaping our own government's thinking, even if we will have little effect on the government of China. It would have been a pleasure to follow the noble Lady Kennedy, whose reputation as a campaigner for human rights is well known, but she apologises and asked me to apologise for her as she has a pressing family engagement which she cannot avoid. My Lords, I have two interests relevant to this debate to declare. The first is that I am a trustee of the China Oxford Scholarship Fund, a small charity founded by my friend, the late Tim Beardson, about 25 years ago. He set up the China Oxford Scholarship Fund to provide postgraduate scholarships at the University of Oxford for students from China, Hong Kong and Macau. Up to 15 scholarships are awarded annually. Preference is given to those who are studying in the United Kingdom for the first time. Successful candidates are those of the highest calibre studying in any subject. They are chosen for their academic excellence, financial need, leadership qualities, and their commitment to contributing to the development of China. Now, Charlie Parton, a former diplomat who spent 22 years working in China and now a senior associate fellow at RUSI, said recently at a conference that on the face of it, there was nothing wrong with collaboration and cooperation between British and Chinese universities. A round table on education was fine with the right safeguards, but he warned that the issue was over science and technology, where, and I quote, the distinction between civil uses, military uses, and the repression uses just melts away. He went on to say, that's where British universities have to be extra careful on cooperation. Ken McCallum, the Director General of MI5, has previously warned that universities are, and again I quote, magnetic targets for espionage and for manipulation, end of quote, and that China and other hostile states are stealing intellectual property from them with, and I quote, dispiriting regularity. He said that he had no issue with cooperation, but said it needed to be done with safeguards and the right level of awareness. Now, at the COSF, we are realists and more than aware of the dangers, but we are also not so naive as to think that wringing our hands will release Jimmy Lai. Which brings me to my second interest. I am a member of the Bar, who specialises in media law cases and who has advised plaintiffs and defendants in Hong Kong, both before and after 1997, on freedom of expression questions. But what is happening in Hong Kong now concerns me not just as a lawyer, but as someone who believes in the rule of law, open justice, and the right to say what one thinks and believes within the rule of law. Those concepts which we take for granted in this jurisdiction are all under threat in Hong Kong, as the noble Lord Alton so powerfully pointed out. That of itself is fundamentally wrong, and in breach of all the principles that this Parliament stands for, and any United Kingdom government should stand for. But it is also in breach of the joint declaration made by this country and China exactly 40 years ago today in 1984, in preparation for the handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997. That treaty has a 50-year life with 20 years to run. That it will become time expired doesn't permit us to let it wither, be ignored, or undermined. It's not just the National Security Law, or the NSL, inflicted upon Hong Kong in 2000, which evidences the erosion of civil liberties and human rights. It is the daily conduct of the authorities in Hong Kong in attacking its own citizens and expatriate Hong Kong UK citizens, making extraterritorial arrests and locking up anyone they find inconvenient or tiresome. The House of Lords Library staff, and I thank them for their research, tell us that about 304 people have been arrested for suspected acts or activities that endanger national security under the NSL. And as we know, and we've seen in the press, 45 others have been jailed for conspiring to commit subversion. These are all ridiculous and absurd allegations. But nonetheless, this is the daily working of the Chinese and the Hong Kong government's way of doing justice. My Lords, we know from open source information and from what we ourselves can see and hear for ourselves that the Chinese government pays no attention to human rights or the rule of law. It pays no attention to the complaints, no matter how politely delivered, by Western leaders. The recent statements issued by UK government ministers and the interventions made by the Prime Minister directly with President Xi, and I applaud them for making them, must be more than merely formulaic verbiage. With interlocutors who have no regard and perhaps don't even understand, still less care about the concepts we are worried about, we need to use commercial leverage with our allies and be ready to cause China actual economic harm to get our message home. If that costs us as well, it will be a price worth paying, but a China that sees no diplomatic, military or monetary disadvantage in ignoring us and our allies is a China that will continue to push outwards, to crush domestic dissent and assert itself at our expense. We have a choice: to act or simply to watch. Jimmy Lai, an elderly UK citizen incarcerated in Hong Kong for simply expressing his opinion and allowing others to do so through his newspaper, not only suffers as an individual human being, but stands as a representative of all those in Hong Kong under its authoritarian and unjust regime. I urge the government not just to issue statements, but to take retaliatory action to ensure that his case is dealt with properly, justly and speedily. He should be released and permitted, if he chooses, to leave Hong Kong with his wife. He should not be in prison for his thoughts and his words. My Lord, now is the time. Let us choose to act, not just to watch.
My Lords, rather like Christmas, which seems to come around faster every year, so the opportunity for changes to British policy on China seems to come around rather rapidly. Under the coalition, but particularly one sensed with George Osborne when he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, there was a great opening up to China, a great interest in having investment. We then saw a pivot to thinking that perhaps China was a threat, a country with which we shouldn't necessarily work closely, although we never stopped doing business. And now we're waiting for His Majesty's government's China audit, but we have at the moment the 3 C's of David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, about competition, challenge and cooperation. And I'm very grateful to my noble friend Lord Alton of Liverpool for bringing this very important debate this afternoon, because it is indeed timely, not just because of the 40th anniversary of the Sino-British Agreement over Hong Kong, but precisely because there is an audit, but also because we have seen very recently the Foreign Secretary meeting his Chinese opposite number and the Prime Minister meeting President Xi, the first time, as I understand it, that a British Prime Minister had met the President for 6 years. And in that time, in the United Kingdom, many things have changed. The Prime Ministers have changed almost as often as the calendar. But in China, very little has changed. Because if you have a president for life, the long-term policy making can be very different. And so the Chinese planning for security and Chinese actions against Tibetans and Uyghurs can persist. And at this point, I would briefly mention an interest. I have recently become a trustee of the Parliamentary Human Rights Trust. Don't think it directly affects this debate, but I thought I should mention it, because clearly one of the concerns that this House has long had, that the International Relations and Defence Committee has had, and committees in the other place, is precisely about human rights issues in Hong Kong, in Tibet, and in Xinjiang. So I would like to ask His Majesty's Government what assessment it has made about the situation in Xinjiang, that the excellent library report of the House of Lords Library suggests that ministers have been talking about the situation of possible forced labour in the supply chain. And the response from Minister Mike Wood was very much that as we move forward, all UK businesses must conduct thorough due diligence to ensure that their supply chains are free from forced labour. Excellent. I'm sure that's exactly what should be happening. But what mechanism is there to ensure that that happens? But in particular, while we absolutely could be calling on the largest companies that have been named in various reports, companies like Rolls-Royce and others, which clearly have every opportunity to ask the right questions. But what about smaller companies? Do they have really the opportunity to be engaging in that due diligence? Because it's vital, but it's also very difficult, and yet another imposition on companies, small and medium-sized companies. But, my lords, there are, apart from human rights concerns, which we've already heard very thoroughly outlined by the Noble Lord Lord Alton and the Noble and Learned Lord Lord Garnier, there are significant security issues that are not necessarily talked about very frequently. But what assessment is His Majesty's Government making about Chinese interests in the Arctic and the Antarctic? China sees itself as a near neighbour of the Arctic, and one which clearly has business interests in terms of the more navigable the Arctic sea region becomes, the greater the interests. President Xi suggested on meeting Prime Minister Starmer that we could cooperate, that there were areas of common interest in trade and in investment. Where are those trade and investment interests coming from? Do they benefit the United Kingdom, or do they only benefit China? But there is a final question that I wanted to ask, which is about higher education. So I will very briefly declare my other interest as Professor of European Politics at Cambridge University. But this is an issue that affects universities across this country and the United States. The Chinese Students and Scholars Association, a very quick internet search suggests that universities in the UK and the US have active Chinese Students and Scholars Associations. It's not entirely clear who funds them, but they appear to be intended partly to allow the host communities to find out more about China, but also to allow Chinese students to have full feedback to China. Is His Majesty's Government reassured that these are entirely neutral organisations, simply serving for the mutual benefit of the host university and the students, or are they also an opportunity for China to be looking for students to investigate, spy on, to use a word that's perhaps an unfortunate word, but to feed back on fellow students, particularly students perhaps from Hong Kong, who may feel vulnerable?
I'm very grateful to my friend, the Noble Lord Alton of Liverpool, for securing this vital and urgent debate, and I congratulate him on his election as chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights. There is no one better qualified to fulfil that role. My Lords, if we are to understand China from the perspective of human rights or security or indeed trade or indeed from any other perspective, we must see the country in its own terms and as it sees itself, rather than simply through Western lenses. To understand China as she understands herself, it will not do to look at her in terms of Marxism or indeed Maoism. If once it was said of the Labour Party that it was more Methodist than Marxist, it can be fairly said of the Chinese Communist Party that it is at least as Confucianist as it is communist. And at the heart of China's concept of itself lies the concept of Jiangxia, a word which means all under heaven and which I almost certainly mispronounce. And even in those three words, all under heaven, you can grasp a sense of its import. It is an ancient concept, dating at least to the start of the first millennium BC, describing a system of relations across Asia with China as the centre of the civilized world and the apex of culture, the heart of a sage empire spreading material benefits and wisdom to all mankind, a geopolitical system with China at the centre and the emperor at the centre of the centre. When Lord Macartney visited the emperor in 1793 to discuss trade terms, the emperor stated that China was the foremost and most divine nation on earth and had no need of foreign goods. And that was a pure expression of Jiangxia. In subsequent decades, with the Opium Wars, the collapse of the empire, the disaster of the Second World War and Maoism, the concept took quite a battering, only for it to reassert itself now under President Xi, just as neo-Tsarism has in Russia. In contemporary China, Jiangxia manifests itself in the ideology of one country, one people, one party, one leader. And it has global implications too. In the words of Steve Chang, the director of SOAS China Institute, President Xi is undeterred by Western objections because he believes in the moral righteousness and the inevitability of Chinese global leadership. Of course he does, because he believes in Jiangxia. And as we can see, as has been outlined in this debate, it manifests itself in Tibet, Xinjiang and Hong Kong, in the South China Sea, in aggression towards Taiwan, in transnational repression and malign influence, as we have seen here in recent days. And the Belt and Road Initiative is just another manifestation of it. And it is specifically seen in violations of religion or belief. Of course, religious minorities, Muslims in Xinjiang, Buddhists in Tibet, Falun Gong and Christians across China must be repressed because they do not accept that ultimate authority rests with the one at the heart of the system, as Jiangxia dictates. So how do we address it? Not by assuming that China believes in the international rules-based system, but by understanding ideologically and indeed theologically where China is coming from. China simply does not see itself as one nation-state amongst many. Jiangxia will not allow for that. A religiously illiterate approach that relies on Western secular assumptions simply won't do. And we cannot counter a 3 millennia-old concept by appeal to a Universal Declaration of Human Rights drawn up only in 1948, deeply as I believe in it. We must take a religiously informed approach to such a concept. And in that light, I warmly welcome the announcement of the new Freedom of Religion or Belief Special Envoy, the member for North Northumberland, David Smith, MP. He is very well equipped to take on this role, not only to advocate for marginalised communities, but to help us understand these big picture issues as they relate to increased authoritarianism and repression in the world today. And I very much hope that despite reports to the contrary, his office will be properly resourced, both financially and in terms of staff, so he can make the fullest impact possible in his role. There is no doubt that with Senator Rubio in post as Secretary of State and note that he himself is currently under a Chinese travel ban, there is no doubt that the incoming Trump administration will foreground freedom of religion or belief in foreign policy, and Mr. Smith's appointment gives us the perfect opportunity to make common cause with the United States on this issue, and we must grasp it. Only a robust approach to China will do. My Lords, it is not my place to suggest what that approach might be, though the implementation of the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme seems to me a good place to start. But in this, my Lords, we are not powerless. The UK and our allies are not without influence. We must use our seat on the Security Council. Despite what the Emperor said to Lord Macartney, China needs our trade, but we cannot trade at any price, and we must not leave this too late.
My Lords, it's a great pleasure to follow the Right Reverend Prelate, and there was much on his reflections and looking at things from a lens of a country which he knows. From various discussions we've had, I agree with him in totality. May I begin also in thanking the noble Lord, indeed my dear friend, Lord Alton, for tabling this debate. I must admit, as a minister, I'm no longer the target of his daily emails and phone calls. It's missed, I think, in some shape or form, but I'm sure the new government is receiving with welcoming arms. But I pay tribute to the noble Lord for his perseverance on a whole raft of issues of human rights, despite, and let's be very clear, the many personal challenges and attacks he faces, including sanctions, in standing up for the oppressed, for standing up for the persecuted around the world. I turn first, though, to governance. In early 2025, we hear the government will provide this audit. What exactly will be the format and the presentation to Parliament, and I'm sure the Minister will cover this in her concluding remarks. But I do request the Minister that once that is done, to facilitate a meeting with your Lordship's House on this important element. However, equally linked to this, I have a relevant question. Is that the material difference between the government's approach and indeed that of the previous government? Noble Lords will know that the integrated review, refreshed in 2023, built our approach to China at that time. It was cross-government, was focused on 3 pillars. Protect. The UK would strengthen its national security, protections in areas where the actions of the CCP posed a threat to the country's people, prosperity and security. We would prioritise cybersecurity and defensive capabilities, whilst also strengthening protections for academic freedom and university research. The question I have for the Minister: does the government believe that approach is correct? Secondly, align. The UK would deepen cooperation and alignment with key allies and partners to shape the broader strategic environment. The government said UK aimed to work collectively with allies and partners to encourage China to contribute transparently and proportionately to the financial stability and economic development around the world, but equally push back against behaviours that undermined international law, violated human rights, or sought to coerce or create dependencies. Again, I ask the Minister, does the government agree with this approach? And finally, engage, that the UK would engage directly with China through bilateral channels and international fora, including the UN Security Council, seeking to preserve and create space for open, constructive and stable relations that reflect China's global significance, which is an undeniable fact. The government also stated it believed in the potential benefits of positive trade and investment relationships with China, whilst at the same time safeguarding critical supply chains and national security. Does the Minister agree with that? If the answer to all 3 questions is yes, we need to move forward and start motoring. First of all, in the multilateral sphere, cooperation on conflict resolution. What engagement is taking place? The G20 meeting with the Prime Minister and President Xi. What has happened subsequently? The Human Rights Council, I've raised this before, and the UN Third Committee. Statements, what has happened specifically in these areas on the issues such as Xinjiang and the issue of Uyghur Muslims. I know during my time as the UK Human Rights Minister for over 7 years, we led on bringing together an ever-growing number of nations to highlight the plight of the community and other minorities. What steps is the government taking to build upon the work of the previous government in strengthening this coalition of almost 50 nations? and in welcoming the appointment of the new envoy. Indeed, I'm personally vested. I was the first envoy and helped create the role. I want to ask the Minister, how is the international alliance, in where my dear friend Fiona Bruce played such a pivotal role, being utilised in this particular respect? Issues of contention and profound disagreements remain between the UK and China, some, of course, which have been amplified in recent days and remain at the core of this relationship. Our colleagues, including the Noble Lord Alton and Baroness Kennedy, remain under sanction by the Chinese authorities. The previous Prime Ministers had direct meetings with those sanctioned, and I'd asked the Noble Lady, the Minister, through her good offices, to ensure that continues. The issues of Hong Kong and the national security law, Xinjiang, I've already mentioned. But in the spirit of the season, if we are to move forward in turning a page and perhaps a new chapter in this relationship, we need to bear in mind, as the Right Reverend Prelate just reminded us, China itself recognises itself on the need for collective action. President Xi is also focused on a revival of the teachings and philosophy of Confucius. Indeed, it is to that philosophy I turn in the spirit of building a bridge, of moving forward to lay the foundations for addressing serious human rights concerns and related freedoms. It was Confucius who said, and I quote, "To be able under all circumstances to practice 5 things constitutes perfect virtue. These 5 things are gravity, generosity of soul, sincerity, earnestness, and kindness." I therefore reach out to the Chinese authorities and trust the Minister will agree. Let us move forward in that spirit in this season with some immediate practical steps. Remove the sanctions from our colleagues in Parliament and beyond as a first step, and let us build a new dialogue. Recognise that major challenges of the world, be they a resolution to the wars in Ukraine or peace in the Middle East, require collaboration. Build on the fact and experience of recent history that when a pandemic engulfed the world, cooperation between nations was the bedrock of a new dawn between the tragedy that impacted us all. Release those who are held in detention for calling for freedom of expression, as my noble friend Lord Garnier expressed so powerfully about Jimmy Lai, a man who has suffered for far too long, whose health is deteriorating, and show compassion and clemency to him and his family, reflective of the season of goodwill, but also of the central tenet of Confucius, of generosity and kindness. End this trial now and return our citizen. And finally, the Sino-British Treaty. Revive the freedom of expressions. End acts of suppression. My Lords, to end, China is important to the UK, but equally, the UK is important to China. We have differences and profound disagreements, yes, different governance systems, yet the links between our two nations are deep-rooted in business, in education, from science and cooperation to culture and cuisine, underpinned and defined by our people-to-people links. So we are on a crossroads at this time, my Lords. I've sought to outline some simple, practical steps that can be taken, which, in my view, I hope and pray, may turn the trajectory of travel to a more positive space.
Yeah.
My Lords, as the grandson of former medical missionaries in southwest China, I take great interest in this debate, and I'm really grateful, as others have expressed, to the Noble Lord Alton for his remarkable and indefatigable commitment to human rights and freedom of religion or belief all around the world. Mm-hmm. And also so grateful to Lord Ahmed. It's a privilege to speak after you, after Noble Lord Ahmed, for his huge commitment in this area over many years too. Yeah. I share with my forebears a deep respect for the Chinese people, their culture, their discipline and their character, but I've also been horrified by stories of the oppression and maltreatment of religious minorities and critics of the regime over very many years, and have paid several illuminating visits to China to witness that for myself. This afternoon, though, I would like to highlight with others the desperate situation of Uyghur Muslims in the northwestern region of Xinjiang, whom the other place has declared to be subjected to genocide, and specifically to urge His Majesty's government to ensure that the screening of goods made in forced labour camps, everything from solar panels to tomatoes, might prevent them from being imported into this country. The challenges faced by Uyghur Muslims are now well documented. Herded into so-called vocational skills, education and training centres, surrounded by guards who operate a shoot-to-kill policy from any who would try to escape. Subjected to mass indoctrination, forced labour and coercive sterilisation, it is hard to imagine a more egregious example of modern slavery in the world today. and it was hugely encouraging that the Labour Party in opposition gave such unwavering commitment to the call to designate these atrocities as genocide, pure and simple, or we might say impure and simple. The response of other Western allies has been similarly forceful, but supported by actions which His Majesty's government has thus far failed to match. The Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act in the USA and the EU's Forced Labour Investment Screening Mechanism already work to prevent goods from the region reaching the US and European markets. In the EU, there is a legal requirement for border officials to screen goods coming into their respective countries, while the USA has reversed the burden of proof on businesses to guarantee so far as possible that their supply chains are not tainted by Uyghur Muslim forced labour. But no such mechanism exists in the UK today, demonstrating a serious lack of alignment with our allies in an area where we should be joined at the hip. In the last 6 months, 2 direct cargo routes have been established from Urumqi, capital of Xinjiang province, to airports in Bournemouth and Cardiff. Media reports state that European Cargo, a UK company registered in Hertfordshire, is ferrying goods to this country from an area declared to be the subject of an ongoing genocide. Meanwhile, ministers have informed a colleague that the UK Border Force currently has no power or legal obligation to search those flights, which creates a gaping loophole for those who would seek to profit from the current atrocities being experienced. In answer to a recent written question asking His Majesty's government what plans they have, if any, to suspend cargo routes from Xinjiang to UK airports, the noble Lord Hendy replied, His Majesty's government have no plans to restrict cargo operations between Xinjiang and UK airports. The decision to operate particular routes is a commercial decision for airlines. His Majesty's government has previously made commitments to tackle the scourge of modern slavery, but until this loophole is closed, the UK will effectively become the dumping ground for goods produced in such horrendous circumstances. Indeed, it may well be that already. I would therefore ask the government to develop policies similar to those of the US and EU to ensure that this debate leads beyond our rhetoric or good intentions into the solid action which is so urgently needed.
My Lords, it's a very great pleasure to follow the Right Reverend the Bishop of Guildford, and I'd like to congratulate the noble Lord Alton on securing this debate on government policy to China and for highlighting these grave issues. May I also pay tribute to him, along with other noble lords, for dedicating his immense knowledge, experience and wisdom to the service of people and causes which can often be buried beneath the rhetoric and power of the overbearing and tyrannical state. Noble lords have spoken, as has Lord Alton, about China's conduct of affairs backed by a show of force. The violations of agreements such as our own 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration on Hong Kong, under which it was pledged to one country, 2 systems for 50 years, and the horrid violations and imprisonments that have taken place there. Taiwan threatened by President Xi's refusal to rule out force for what he calls reunification, to say nothing of the religious and ethnic persecution of religious and ethnic minorities in Tibet and Western Xinjiang province, the Uyghurs, to which noble lords have drawn attention. The UK government has, as we have heard, set out its approach to cooperate cautiously, to trade and to challenge. But, my lords, can there really be UK cooperation as equal partners on trade and economic matters with China? Trading as equals can be the only true basis on which a Western democracy such as the UK can cooperate, given China's economic power, now the second largest globally, and that is based on its vast wealth, its imperviousness to WTO trade rules, for example on state subsidies, its untrustworthy record on IP and cyber espionage, prompting action by the US, and its bid for regional, strategic, and military dominance. Now, although China is not the UK's first trading partner, but our fifth largest, we do have a trade deficit with China. And given the strategic and sensitive nature of Chinese imports into the UK and its FDI, foreign direct investment, in the UK, it has already achieved great leverage on our economy. Chinese investors, and if the figures vary, have around 134 billion of assets in UK industries, which range, as we know openly, it's no secret, to a large share in Hinkley Point C nuclear power station. China General Nuclear Power holds a 33.5% stake in the plant, which is owned by EDF. A 10% share in Heathrow, and it has interests in breweries a Chinese individual has, such as Green King, and retail outlets such as Superdrug, utilities such as Northumbrian Water, with around 200 companies being in the hands of Chinese individuals from China or Hong Kong. And these include state-run organizations and the Chinese Investment Corporation. I would like to ask the Noble Lord, the Minister, what precautionary measures the government intends, the Noble Lady, the Minister, forgive me, what precautionary measures the government intends to protect the UK strategically and its vital security in power plants, energy companies, IT and electronics against dominance by Chinese investors, state or otherwise. Rather than go ever deeper into trading arrangements with China, with all their drawbacks, my view is that Britain should concentrate on the benefits from developing trade and its economic ties with other trading partners, to make common cause, for instance, as the Right Reverend the Bishop of Winchester has suggested, with the incoming US regime, to which the Bishop drew attention. I also recommend, and this is a theme I hope the Noble Lord Lung will forgive me for returning to, that we really do develop and are alert to what can be done as a leading global partner now that we are members of the CPTPP, and how we can not only develop our own trade there with this dynamic and ever-growing alliance, but help our new partners in the CPTP against predatory or hegemonic Chinese economic moves, given the wide area of influence that China already commands, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but with individual CPTP countries. 50% of them are intermediate products, are based on already 20% of Chinese goods are destined for CPTPP countries. 50% of them are immediate products of those countries. Malaysia, Vietnam, and Mexico have the highest level of imports from China. With the UK, that figure goes up to 13% of our imports, because given the nature of our imports from China. May I ask the Noble Lady, the Minister, will the UK government commit to ensuring that it does everything possible to lead and strengthen the CPTPP as a free trading bloc and an alternative to our trading partners, or indeed ourselves, being dependent on the Chinese economy? And to return to a subject which we've been debating in a committee, will it ensure that no measure is taken under the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill which would undermine the UK's ability both to exploit the opportunities of the CPTPP and act as a beacon of global free trade with our new partners?
My Lords, I thank the Noble Lord Lord Alton for securing this timely debate, particularly in the context of the history of Hong Kong, and for the Noble Lord's typically powerful introduction, which is only what your Lordship's House would expect. I want to begin this final debate of 2024 with a big picture overview of the state of the world. Geopolitically, we are an unstable, dangerous mess. The climate is running out of control, overheating very visibly and obviously. Nature, biodiversity is in a state of collapse. Human lives, we're going backwards in poverty, hunger and inequality. We are not doing well. And that is not because we've been derailed from some ongoing train of so-called development and progress. It's a product of the nature of politics around the world in recent decades, particularly in the hugely influential United States and us with our own UK influences. It's a legacy of colonialism and neocolonialism, extractivism and exploitation, the enriching of the few at the expense of the many. Which is not to say that there hasn't been real progress in the decades since World War II, progress that has been driven by civil society, which has developed a framework of international norms, what we generally call human rights, which were not given over to us by states, but driven by campaigners that forced us forward. Civil society action has got us to that point, but it's dependent on government action to really put these into effect. And that means that governments have to apply these frameworks of norms, these human rights, apply the judgments without fear or favour, not to use them as a stick to beat the people we dislike and to quietly ignore what we see as our friends and allies are doing. And I have to say that I would love to see a debate in your Lordship's House similar to this one, focused on the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia, which is every bit as bad as China. Now, Noble Lords have here talked about, as I've done in other contexts, the situation, the horrendous genocide against the Uyghurs, the situation in Tibet, the situation in Hong Kong, the threats to Taiwan and in the South China Sea. I'm not going to go back over that ground because it's been covered very well already. I want to take two different angles here. One is to say, as no one has yet said, that in this complex world facing the threats of the planetary boundaries being exceeded, we do have to talk to China. On the climate emergency and nature crisis, they are crucially important actors. And of course, as a number of Noble Lords have pointed out, they make many of the products we use every day. That's the trade that the Noble Lady Baroness Lawler was just referring to. And we have to acknowledge that the responsibility for the environmental impacts of those objects we use rests with us, as well as with China. And we're going to see in the coming year a real focus on a duty to prevent human rights abuses and environmental damage for our companies, for our supply chain, and this is important to consider in this context. But it's really important to say that business interests, or indeed the need to talk about climate and nature crises, shouldn't stop us at every opportunity raising human rights in conversation with the Chinese regime, shouldn't stop us deciding on sanctions, shouldn't stop us providing refuge to those seeking asylum from the Chinese regime. Now, I think it's important to note that this afternoon the Prime Minister and the Liaison Committee, referring to safe and legal routes for people to find asylum in the UK, said he was happy that what we had now with Afghanistan, Ukraine and Hong Kong. A direct question to the Noble Lady, the Minister, surely we also want to provide safe legal routes for people from other parts of China who might be seeking asylum in the UK to be able to come here. Hong Kong is enormously important, but it shouldn't just be Hong Kong. Now, my second point is, I hope I've already used in all of my own words. The Noble Lord's question refers to China's actions and policy towards China. Now, that may indeed have been what the Table Office was happy to have, but I would urge all Noble Lords to not regard China as a single entity. China is not the Chinese regime. It's really important that we don't take make ahistorical orientalising assumptions about China as some unchanging monolithic entity. I note the Human Rights Watch, for example, has a whole series of reports about how there have been protests within China, terribly brave actions by people from within China at great risk to themselves. So let's not talk about China, let's talk about the Chinese regime and acknowledge there are Chinese people, not just within the parts of China we've identified, but other parts of China as well, who are taking action that we should be acknowledging. I note there are really brave feminist LGBTIQA+ activists in China who have paid a hideous price for taking actions in those areas. Finally now, however, changing tone. Given this is the final green speech of the year, I want to particularly offer thanks to the staff who keep us going through these long and strange hours through which we work, and particularly to them and to all noble lords, to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Yeah. My lords, like others, I thank the noble Lord Alton for his securing of this debate, but unlike others, I also praise him for the precious timing that he managed to secure for this debate as well. We will leave this as the last message of the year. My lords, we've already heard speeches regarding important speeches around human rights, and I'm sure we'll hear some more. But as the noble Lord Alton intimated, I want to change gear. And I want to take, let's say, a secular approach, perhaps a utilitarian approach to the issue of technology and the threat of Chinese technology to our security. And I'm going to use the specific to illustrate the general. My lords, my first specific is LiDAR, which is light detection and ranging technology. This is used for mapping and sensing in autonomous vehicles, drones, trains, and airports. And utility providers and infrastructure operators use LiDAR to monitor pipelines, power lines, and rail networks. As your lordships will understand, these are all important areas. In 2020, Chinese firms had a 58% share of the global automotive LiDAR market. I don't have later stats, but I expect these will now have risen due to the copious use of subsidies, market protections, procurement preference, as well as the systematic acquisition of foreign intellectual property. Chinese LiDAR poses a danger because it collects sensitive data and can receive over-the-air updates, enabling potentially undetectable changes to systems, and those could compromise operation. Next, we have cellular IoT modules, IoT, the Internet of Things. These are the things that connect everything to the Internet, and they're used in a vast array of critical infrastructure applications: energy, logistics, manufacturing, transport, health, and security, to name but some. They remotely monitor and control complex systems, and they collect vast amounts of data and metadata for analysis, processing, and response management. Chinese pricing is often up to 25% below manufacturing cost, helping to gain it already a 70% share of the world market. Quite apart from the leverage that can be applied via this dominant position, China has potential access to very large amounts of data and can remotely interfere with devices, switching off or degrading critical national infrastructure. Domination of key markets is a Chinese strategy across many technologies. For example, photovoltaics, where China's share of all manufacturing stages for solar panels exceeds 80%. Once again, this has happened by using very low price levels that are supported by subsidy, and they've crushed most of their international opposition. Lithium-ion batteries are another example. China dominates the whole battery supply chain, producing well over 80% of all key components. Graphite, copper, nickel, cobalt are the raw materials needed for batteries, and their use will rise staggeringly. For example, by 2040, estimates point to a 9 times increase in lithium requirement for above current use. While US and European companies do play significant roles in some areas of lithium and copper asset ownership, China has invested $10 billion in overseas mining in the first half of 2023 alone. China dominates nickel and cobalt production, notably in Indonesia and the Congo, and controls 93% of battery-grade graphite refining. Rare earth metals, vital for manufacturing not just batteries, but also wind turbines, phone displays and fibre optic cables, will see a surge of demand. Again, China dominates refining and production and is expected to increase its share above the current 80%. Now, looking forward to AI and quantum computing, here, the Chinese effort is currently somewhat behind the US and the West. But we've already seen that if China decides to move forward, it moves forward at pace. Advanced chips are key to this, and China continues to grow its domestic chip industry. A $47.5 billion investment fund was announced this year, and the West has been slow to respond. Delays applying sanctions allowed China to buy time and stockpile, whilst an increase in its chip purchases now indicate that it's still stockpiling for future problems. Meanwhile, quantum computing, which has the potential to completely change the way our computers and devices work and poses a significant security risk, at the moment, China and the US lead. But China is certainly further ahead in moves to try to deploy this technology with infrastructure and 2 satellites with quantum communication capability. My Lords, thanks to the tireless work of some of the people speaking in this debate, the last government began to wake to the dangers. In October 2022, work started on removing Huawei from UK telecoms infrastructure. But this is only due to be completed in 2027. And there's been partial moves regarding Hikvision surveillance cameras, but not even scratching the surface of this problem. But where is our coordinated approach to this? The pattern in the UK is piecemeal, it's slow, and I would say it's largely ineffective. So to conclude, my Lords, this is not paranoia. The danger is there, and the government needs to be honest in its audit. China has a predatory pricing strategy based on massive subsidies and sometimes slave labour designed to eliminate its Western rivals. It's acquired global dominance in key raw materials and processing. It's had launched programmes to gather IP from across the world by any means, as we heard from the Noble Lord Garnier. And, perhaps most worryingly, it's established deep penetration of our critical infrastructure and key equipment with the capacity for detailed covert surveillance and remote control. My Lords, this is not the half of it, as we heard from the Baroness Lawler. It's clear to all who look, China's technology strategy is a threat, a serious threat to our security and an existential threat to our capacity to deliver manufacturing when we need it. So I ask the Minister to confirm that she too recognises this threat and that the audit will absolutely take this on board.
Yeah. My Lords, another excellent speech by the Noble Lord, the Lord Fox, and a brilliant peroration, as he concluded. And of course, that's building on 8 other excellent speeches we've heard in this debate, and following the superb launch of the debate by the Right Honourable, by the Noble Lord, well, my noble friend, I call him, Lord Alton of Liverpool, who's campaigned on this issue for many years. And how wonderful to hear 2 robust speeches from Church of England bishops, rather than the usual fence-sitting stuff. And I particularly like what the Bishop of Winchester had to say. But I think he's right. It's not just this Yangtze culture. Is there not a deeply ingrained racist element in that they believe only the Han ethnicity are the only real people, and every other ethnic race is just vermin or infidels to be destroyed? And I'm grateful for the Reverend Pledit nodding that I got that, well, he's something right in my speech today. So, my Lords, how is China, the country described by the FCO as a strategic partner and one which this government is determined to have pragmatic relationships with, what's it doing? Well, it's oppressing its own people, both directly through an extensive network of black jails and indirectly with no free press. In Xinjiang province, this House and 11 other countries have said that the Chinese state is committing genocide, and in Tibet is seeking to deny people their culture and identity. It's running what has been described as the world's largest contemporary system of state-imposed forced labour, with up to 2.5 million Uyghurs and members of other ethnic groups at risk of coerced work. In Hong Kong, it's reneged on an internationally registered treaty with the UK to deny the city's residents their civil and political rights. It's stealing islands, building military bases and deploying paramilitary forces to bully its neighbours in the South China Seas, despite an international ruling that its claims are unfounded. It is engaged in the largest military build-up since World War II, adding the equivalent of the entire Royal Navy every 2 years. Its programme of civil-military fusion subserviates its economy to military needs. It's increasing its military exercises and incursions into Taiwan's airspace and escalating the use of grey zone activities to undermine both Taiwan's will to resist and that of the international community to stand firm against aggression. It's also waging a non-military war against Taiwan by trying to eradicate its right to exist. Taiwan cannot get into the United Nations, nor any of its agencies. China's banned it from the World Health Organization, even though it was Taiwan which raised the alarm about COVID, whilst China covered it up. And China has banned Taiwan from Interpol. China constantly seeks to change the wording of United Nations agreements to freeze out Taiwan. And our own Intelligence and Security Committee has said that China runs the largest state intelligence service in the world, and that it is a threat to our British industry and our technology. China, and when I say China, of course I mean the Communist Party of China, not the whole of the Chinese people, let's be clear on that. But it lied about the origins of COVID, lied to the World Health Organization, lied about the efficacy of its vaccines, and spread conspiracies when seeking to divert responsibility and blame. It destroyed evidence and continues to withhold information on what it knows. And of course it launched a trade war against Australia, Norway and Lithuania when these countries asked questions about the COVID cover-up. And, my lords, that's what's happening around the world. What about the UK? Well, there's a long list of hostile Chinese aggression against our United Kingdom, against individuals and the state and companies. It's mounting on a daily basis massive cyber attacks against the UK, including one targeting members of Parliament and the Electoral Commission in March of this year. A former UK Foreign Secretary said that torture on an industrial scale was happening in Xinjiang province. How can we have a strategic partner, a country committing genocide, my lords? China blatantly steals our technologies and has infiltrated all our universities, of course often held by craven university chancellors more interested in Chinese cash than in freedom of speech. And more recently, have we not seen just how high their spies can penetrate? This was not a one-off quirk, but the result of many years of assiduous penetration of all our top institutions, and many thousands more are still beavering away in our companies, universities and institutions, seeking to undermine our will to resist Chinese aggression. My lords, this is not the actions of a strategic partner with whom we should be having a pragmatic relationship. These are the actions of a hostile state. And why won't the government, including the last government too, why won't they listen to our own top security experts? The current head of MI5, Ken McCallum, has said that China is engaged on espionage on an epic scale. He keeps making that message every few months. Let's listen to him. Of course, China is a massive trading entity which we cannot cut ourselves off from. Yes, trade with China. Trust China? No. The Henry Jackson Society published a large report in 2020 showing the UK is strategically dependent on China for 229 categories of goods. 229 categories we are strategically dependent on. And 57 of these have applications in critical national infrastructure. This must not continue, my lords. We have let China get a stranglehold over some of our vital commodities, parts and components which could cripple us economically and possibly militarily as a country if China turned off the tap. So we must accelerate onshoring and taking back to the UK things we should be making here, or having various suppliers from other friendly countries around the world supplying us. So China, my lords, is a hostile country. It is a clear and present danger to the West. It seeks to dominate us economically, militarily and politically. China is not a strategic partner. It's just a ruthless commercial competitor, and we should treat it as such. We must open our eyes and acknowledge the nature of the threat posed to us. Then we can plan to combat it. And only from a position of security and strength can we then consider being pragmatic.
My Lords, I'm delighted to follow the noble Lord Blencathra, and I too thank my noble friend Lord Alton for never letting up on China. We are, all of us, very grateful, and this being the last debate of this particular session and this year, it is very fitting. My Lords, I think that this House is becoming louder in its warning about the threat that the People's Republic of China and the PRC poses to the UK's security and economy. The actual and perceived threats help to shape UK foreign policy with regard to China, and yet many commentators would argue that the UK, despite some welcome announcements from the government, still does not have a viable political strategy on China and remains therefore vulnerable to events as they occur. What is urgently needed, as so many have said, is a clear statement of red lines with regard to PRC, suppression of minorities, and a policy incorporating concerns about and action on cyber and other attacks, aggressive threatening of international shipping lanes and trading relations in the event of severe tariffs imposed by the USA. My Lords, the question of Chinese technology and its inroads on the UK has been very ably covered by the noble Lord Fox, but I would like to just perhaps underline that. The PRC, as we know, is intent on achieving world monopoly of electronic communications technology. Cellular modules of the Internet of Things are crucial, as we've heard, to almost all aspects of infrastructure, such as logistics, power grids, water supplies, or ability to paralyze financial payment systems. Chinese companies currently own about 70%, as we'd heard, of the world market in cellular modules. Other countries struggle to compete with subsidized Chinese manufacture, which has a protected domestic market and seeks to gain a monopoly by means of supply of parts, favorable regulation, financing at competitive rates, access to key materials and products such as semiconductors at a low cost. And the PRC, let us not forget, is ever vigilant at taking over potentially failing companies around the world. My Lords, the consequences of anything approaching a monopoly of PRC supplied parts and the access to data that this would facilitate are severe. For example, bringing the UK Defence Forces to a standstill. My Lords, my predominant interest remains in the democratic independence of Taiwan, a country expressly targeted by President Xi as ripe for integration with the mainland of China and of great strategic importance to China. This intention has been repeated too often to be ignored. Although expert opinion doubts that there is an imminent possibility of invasion, the so-called grey attacks are increasing in number and severity. Frequent military exercises are intended to disrupt and intimidate the Taiwanese, as are efforts to undermine Taiwan's economy and democratic institutions. Taiwan, as we all know, is the world's largest producer of superior semiconductors. Despite competition from China and the USA to build semiconductor facilities, the technological skills and environment required are considerable and unlikely to surpass Taiwanese production rates. Although this is a great strength for Taiwan, it is also a liability, making integration with China all the more desirable for the PRC. Any interruption to the supply of raw materials, clean water or labour would have an immediate effect on production and compromise the global market for consumer electronics, currently valued at $1 trillion. The top 20 clients of the semiconductor manufacturing company is worth in excess of $7 trillion. My Lords, why does Taiwan's continued existence as a separate entity matter? Apart from, the democratic view that freedom is preferable to repression, the possibility of a China-controlled region encompassing international shipping lanes is ominous. Not only is China intent on returning to an imperial grandness, but also on surpassing the USA as the world's dominant political and economic force. The ability to control world shipping trade would represent a major step towards its grand plan. The government has committed to a thorough audit on PRC efforts to destabilise the UK defence and security, and this review is eagerly awaited. But meanwhile, my lords, several suggestions as to further protection have been put forward by China experts, and these might include ensuring that the FCDO maintains Mandarin-speaking specialists on China, establishing a China-focused expert committee, preferably at cabinet level, with a range of ministers, particularly in the technological field, to monitor relations with the PRC. This committee would assess the national security risks offered by imported technology, arrive at a clear definition of national security for all government departments, set out priorities for defending critical national infrastructure, build up lists of trusted suppliers on electronic modules and chips and other electronic manufacturers, and identify opportunities to work together with international partners and allies to counter Chinese imperialism. My lords, I would suggest that our thinking and our actions on China should not be dictated by the PRC. With the PRC's largest military build-up since the end of the Second World War, deepening relations with Russia, and increasing incursions into Taiwan and surrounding territories, it's clear that China is laying the ground for future domination beyond the South and Southeast Asian region. And my lords, we ignore this at our peril.
My lords, I refer to my interests as set out in the register and as co-chair of the British Taiwanese All-Party Group. And I thank my friend, the noble Lord Alton, for securing this very important debate, and may I say, for giving us a remarkable speech this afternoon. My lords, China is back in the headlines once again, and true to form, not for good reasons. The relationships between Prince Andrew and an individual spy for China has grabbed the headlines. However, much more important is the fact that Yang Chu is one of tens of thousands of members of the United Work Front Department, which Chairman Mao famously described as one of the three magic weapons of the Chinese Communist Party. And despite its somewhat innocuous name, the UFWC is a deeply sinister organisation which specialises in clandestine activities to advance the Chinese Communist Party's interests at home and abroad. The UFWC is believed to have significantly expanded its activities under President Xi. This, of course, the same President Xi whose hand our own Prime Minister was so keen to shake this month. However, my lords, it seems that Sir Keir Starmer's charm offensive on behalf of our United Kingdom government is only the beginning, with at least 3 senior ministers set to travel to China early next year, including the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And as a consequence of these trips, it has been reported that the government's planned review of Sino-UK relations has been placed on ice. And in the meantime, Beijing continues to bully, harass and threaten the peace-loving people of Taiwan in full public view. As we know, President Xi has reportedly pledged to achieve what is described as the reunification of Taiwan, despite China never having controlled it. Hardly, as Baroness Tsusia said, hardly a day goes by without Chinese fighter jets and military vessels encroaching on Taiwanese space. In recent days, a stopover in Hawaii by Taiwanese President prompted Beijing to deploy its largest Navy fleet in nearly 3 decades to waters near Taiwan. Now, whilst some may put this down to mere scaremongering, there is a view amongst US defence experts that China is readying itself to seize Taiwan by military force in 2027. My Lords, I find it baffling that the United Kingdom government, a new United Kingdom government, maintains its refusal to recognise Taiwan as an independent state and establish diplomatic relations. My Lords, I have been a businessman all my life, and I understand the need for economic growth to get our country back on firm footings. I can even accept that sometimes in business you have to deal with people whose views of the world is a little different from your own. However, my Lords, I will not accept what seems to be the government's view that the only way to attract much-needed inward investment is to bow down to an authoritarian regime in Beijing. As the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Winchester, said, one should not do business at any price. My Lords, earlier this week in another place, the Security Minister, Dan Jarvis, said that the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, or FIRS, designed to protect the UK from covert foreign influence, will not come into force this year as originally planned, but will instead be introduced at some point next summer. My Lords, in light of what we are learning almost every day about Chinese espionage in this country, can I ask the noble lady, the Minister, what plausible reason could there be for this delay? I trust it was not a fear that might upset she and those who signed the cheques. Also, can she give this House a guarantee that when the FIRS does finally come into force, and should China not be placed in the advanced tier, which it certainly should be, that she will return to this House to explain why? My Lords, I do not accept that His Majesty's government is being duplicitous in dealing with China. I want to make that clear. But I do believe that it's been incredibly naive when consequences that could be profoundly serious for our nation.
As the last backbench Speaker of the Year, I also take pleasure in congratulating the noble Lord, Lord Alton, for securing this debate and for the longevity of his interest in the subject and for keeping the flag flying on this during very unpropitious circumstances as it's been for the longest period, and for his part in shifting the consensus in this House and beyond on the threat of the CCP and its institutions. And it must have indeed seemed a lonely thing at times when the coalition was prioritising economic relations and the short-term interpretation of economic relations, perhaps above all other considerations. I'm, however, not the only one also fears that we may be seeing perhaps a revival of aspects of the coalition's approach to these matters in the policies of the current government, or at least the early intimations thereof, prior to the publication of the audit and other reviews. One fears also a certain strategic incoherence in those early intimations. As I say, this part is connected with the prioritisation of economic growth over all else. The danger is that we are trading tomorrow's resilience and straining our alliances for short-term trades with the Chinese currency today. And that is sort of a kind of back-to-the-future approach that many of us had hoped we'd seen the back of. Our allies seem to understand much more clearly than us that it is a fool's game to separate economic and security relationships with Beijing. President Xi has indeed collapsed the distinction between those two matters, viewing trade relations as entirely integral to Chinese grand strategy. Pandering to Beijing is not necessary for maintaining economic relations. On the contrary, UK-China trade in the post-Golden Era stretch of time has increased by 20% each year, even as successive Conservative governments openly criticised Beijing for its transgressions in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. Not often enough, perhaps, but nonetheless, it hasn't sunk our trade with China. Can this government, therefore, be certain that kowtowing to Beijing will result in a flow of inward investment which it so craves? The Prime Minister rightly must engage with President Xi, as he did at the G20 summit. But should a growing list of Secretaries of State rush to Beijing now before the publication of the forthcoming China audit? Too often it appears that Number 10's rationale is to front-load the cosmetic quick wins above everything else. This confusion is compounded by the government's flurry of reviews. 7, by my count, all of which should have a considerable China component. We have the China audit, of course, the FCDO's 3 reviews of the UK's global impact, of development diplomacy, of economic diplomacy. Then there is the strategic defence review, to which Noble Lord Alton has already referred, the AUKUS review, and the Treasury's own spending review. My question is, are these linked together by a core strategic diagnosis of China? Who now is responsible for this? We have seemed in some ways to have disintegrated our national security approach, with multiple reviews reflecting different departmental agendas, absent a guiding hand to ensure coherence. Before July, as my noble friend Lord Ahmed and noble Lord Fox have pointed out, the UK pursued a China policy of align, protect and engage. And it also pursued a policy of aligning with the China policies of our allies, of protecting ourselves from espionage, economic malpractice and coercion, and of engaging where prudent. This hierarchy of priorities was in keeping with the 2023 integrated review, the 2023 refresh of the integrated review, which assessed that China was quote, epoch-defining and systemic challenge. The current government, now at least, as Baroness Smith of Newnham and others have noted, apparently favours a 3 C's approach: cooperate where possible, compete where important, and challenge where necessary. However, this is not a strategy, but is a statement, and absent the necessary prioritisation vis-à-vis Beijing. Most worryingly, the government's 3 C's no longer refers to alignment with partners. We are thus at risk of becoming out of kilter with the Chinese policies of our allies, one of the major gaps that the last government rightly sought to correct. Whatever the reason for this shift, it is causing concern amongst our key allies in both the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific regions. Perhaps the shift to ambiguity is not entirely accidental, but rather it represents a conscious decision. For example, is the government now fast-tracking engagement with Beijing in order to hedge against the incoming Trump administration's apparently more hawkish approach? The consequences of hedging simultaneously whilst the new administration is remaining engaged, forgive me, my noble lords, the policy of hedging whilst the new administration seeks to remain engaged in European security could risk undermining the special relationship with the US administration, which is otherwise very favourably disposed to us. Our friends in places such as Australia urge us to consider their experience, where they withstood similar bullying from China and in fact ended up in the long term stronger, including under the present Australian Labour government. Even the EU now looks set to pursue a tougher line on China than us. The Commission's new foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, former Prime Minister of Estonia, recently dropped the definition of Beijing as a, quote, partner, competitor and systemic rival, electing instead to refer only to the latter point as a systemic rival. The Secretary of State for Business and Trade, Jonathan Reynolds, has stated that we have no plans to allow the EU's tariffs on Chinese vehicles. The government has dropped even the notion of systemic competition, something shared by every single British ally. I think we should be in no doubt that the China challenge demands an approach that is coordinated across Whitehall and across our alliances. Previously, we articulated in an explicitly integrated approach what we needed to do. Now our approach appears to be departmentally balkanised to the extent of literally being a disintegrated approach. I ask the Minister who will bring those disparate reviews together.
My Lords, it's been a fitting quality debate at the end of this calendar year, and we pay tribute to the Noble Lord Alton for bringing this debate to us. And in some respects, I hope that the final debate of 2024 might frame some of the early debates we have in 2025 when it comes to looking at when the government and the Chancellor of the Exchequer visits Beijing and other ministers visit China. Hopefully they will be able to take the contributions in this debate into consideration in the forming of their views, because we've served both a challenge function as also reflecting on some of the needs for us to debate. As my noble friend Baroness Smith said, 'tis the season of another government approach to China, and as the Noble Lord Ahmed outlined the previous administration's approach, we can see the word salad of protect, cooperate, prioritise, challenge, align, compete, and engage. The word that is missing is strategy, and you could add published strategy in front of that. And as pay tribute to my noble friend Lord Fox, because he outlined in such clear terms why we need to have it. But we also saw in the debate, if I can say with great respect, because I both understood and agreed with much of the noble Lady Lola's speech, but I felt as part of the contradiction to some extent of us seeking to move away from trade dependency on China towards other trading partners in the CPTPP who also predominantly have seen growth as a result of trade with China and are now basically a vehicle for us to have enhanced trade with China. And this seems to be the government's adopted approach for trade. It does seem as if the debate that European Union has been the two words that dare not speak its name. If we're seeking to diversify away from trade dependency on China, it might be that we have stronger links with trade with our European neighbours. And I'll be delighted to give way to her if she wishes to intervene. Yes.
Just to clarify, thanks. I thank the noble Lord. My proposal, which wasn't clear at all, was that we should help and encourage those countries who now have a trade dependency with China, i.e. those CPTPP partners, to move away from their trade dependency with China and use our role to do that.
I can understand, I'm grateful for the noble lady. I can understand that as a theoretical approach, but of all of the current CPTPP members, it is the United Kingdom, the newest country with the largest trade deficit of them all with China. They would be looking to us to diversify away from China. So the whole ambition is the other way around. And I think that's where perhaps we hope that if the government is doing a strategic audit, then the government's analysis of this will come to the fore. But as the noble Lord Rogan had indicated, the worrying signs that the audit may not be published, it may be delayed until the Chancellor of the Exchequer has been in Beijing, we may not even have it presented to debate in Parliament. I am starting to be quite concerned. And as my noble Lord Fox had indicated, why do we need this? It's because of the industrial scale economic surveillance and the scraping and capture of data of the UK economy as a tool for both industrial espionage but also for state advantage and for state enterprises to strategically undercut and underprice in certain key sectors of our economy. And as my noble friend Lord Fox's work on other elements when it comes to looking at how the key sectors of our technology and infrastructures, we need to enhance our resilience. And especially now when we see globally what China are doing when it comes to seeking both software and hardware of global ports of entry systems, of shipping and telecommunications. China is not a passive global actor. Now, I acknowledge neither are we, nor is it a criticism that they are not. But the strategic aim for China is to have a sphere of influence in a multipolar world. That is distinct from how we see the world that should be based on a liberal international order of rules. There are differences in how we see global diplomatic and development interactions. And the UK working with partners, yes, of course, but we should be clear that our perspective of the world is distinct. And the Minister said previously in questions and in statements when it comes to this that she was honest with us. She said that she didn't know if the new government's approach will work. She said that in this chamber. But she said it is worth trying. It's worth trying if we are seeking to grow our economy, but the cost of growth of our economy for being a supplicant on a trade deficit level in key sectors means that we are unlikely to see the level of sustainable growth as well as the protection of human rights as well as national security. So yes, of course, partnering in certain areas, but we should not do it blinded. And that is why Lord Rogan and others, and my question to the Minister just this week with regards to the National Security Act that the Noble Lord Coker and I had worked very hard in, that should be evidence-based about national security considerations and threats. It should not be subservient to economic development or one perception of economic development. And that's why we also need to look at when we look at elements of our relationship with Taiwan, as the noble Lady Baroness de Souza said, we also have strategic economic partnerships with Taiwan, but as a liberal, open democracy, which does represent our thinking. And with regards to China, there are further actions that this government can take, which the previous government didn't take, when it looks at auditing UK-based assets owned by the CCP, that looks at potential use of the Magnitsky sanctions against those responsible for the erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms. We can pursue further area of human rights further, and I hope that the government will not set these aside as a result of the Treasury's approach. I had a fascinating visit where I saw the approach that many of the developing nations and economies are taking with regards to China. I was at the Doha Forum last weekend, and I sat in a session with President Kagame for Rwanda and Prime Minister Motley from Barbados and a Chinese operator. What was fascinating to me was that President Kagame said that when he speaks to potentially Western investors, he said, I quote, "We get tons of lectures, not goods." But Prime Minister Motley had said that all of her interactions and developing nations' interactions should be based, I quote, on global principles. There was a contradiction that I heard from them. I pointed out, when it comes to China and Africa, for example, the UK is a bigger investor in Africa than China at the moment. We can assert ourselves with the values of Barbados on global principles and not accept the narrative that there are lectures, but we should be an active participant in this area. I want to close by coming back to what my noble friend Lady Smith had indicated when it comes to the need now for there to be a coherent approach. And it does seem, and perhaps this is referencing the noble Lord Godson's point, it does seem as if the new government's approach is to find a way of engaging with China in a more meaningful and deeper relationship that recognised the threat, but also sought to try to co-opt China into the international order and the approach that many of the world's biggest challenges, like climate or biodiversity loss, were not going to be solved without engagement with China. That seemed to be the approach. That was a direct quote from George Osborne to our International Relations Defence Select Committee, which had my noble friend and I had the pleasure of serving on, when we concluded our report in September 2021 on the UK and China's security and trade relationship. That committee's title was A Strategic Void. And it called for for the government to produce a single, coherent China strategy, as recommended by the Foreign Affairs Committee in April 2019, and a plan for how it will execute that strategy. We are still needing that. The government, if the government believes that it will have a 10-year period in office rather than 5-year period of office, the need for a coherent, published, single China strategy is of vital importance, and I hope that the Minister may agree to it. And as I sit down, I wish all members a very happy Christmas and a Merry New Year, and if I may, he's not in the chamber at the moment, but this will be the last occasion that Mr Cameron Wood, the Deputy Principal Doorkeeper, will carry the mace out as the House rises after 13 years of sterling service to this House. I wish him and all of the staff a very happy Christmas and New Year also.
Well, my lords, this has indeed been an excellent debate, and I want to start by paying tribute to the noble Lord Alton for securing it in the first place, for his excellent sense of timing, and for his tireless, and to quote the Bishop of Guildford, indefatigable campaigning against the Chinese Communist Party and for all of the troubles that it's caused him. But he should have all our support and respect in the work that he does. Now, I don't often agree, as members will know, with the Lord's spiritual, but I do agree that with my noble friend Lord Blencathra, that the outstanding contribution of the Bishop of Winchester, with his explanation of the frankly truly evil nature of the current Chinese leadership, I thought was a particularly good contribution in a sea of very good speeches that we've seen this evening. And I completely agree with Lord Alton's and other noble lords' concerns, I would put it no more highly than that, about the current government's policy towards China, particularly in light of some of the grave human rights abuses, the security challenges that emanate from Beijing's increasingly assertive actions. The news this week dominated the headlines that Yang Tengbo had access to public officials whilst also being an alleged spy is indeed deeply worrying, and I cast no aspersions on the members that were in contact with him. It could all have been done deeply innocently. So I wonder if, in her summary, could the noble Baroness, the Minister, explain how she squares the Foreign Secretary's increasing friendliness with his Chinese counterparts with the threat that they are proven to have posing to our national security. Now, let me start with Hong Kong. Many members have mentioned it, where the Sino-British Joint Declaration, an international treaty, I would remind noble lords, lodged with the United Nations, has been, and there's no other way of putting this, flagrantly violated by China. The complete destruction of the one country, two systems principle has been swift and it has been brutal. The imposition of the national security law has led to the silencing of dissent, the imprisonment of pro-democracy activists, and the, frankly, suppression of free speech and the free press. As many noble lords have observed, this month marks 4 years since 77-year-old Jimmy Lai was placed behind bars in Hong Kong. He is, of course, a British citizen who founded Apple Daily, the largest pro-democracy newspaper in Hong Kong. My lords, we cannot allow Beijing to continue to trample on its international commitments with impunity. And I hope, and I'm sure that they are, the government are using every opportunity to continue to raise his case and to help that he is freed back to join his family. Turning to Taiwan, the spectre, of course, of military aggression looms large. The People's Republic of China continues to engage in provocative military manoeuvres with economic coercion, and with the attempted diplomatic isolation of Taiwan. And I was delighted to join Baroness de Souza, Lord Purvis, and a number of other noble lords in proudly celebrating Taiwan's National Day in October. It's important that we do that. People of Taiwan have proudly built a thriving democracy and a dynamic economy in the face of these constant threats, and it is imperative that we all stand with them, not only because it is right, but because the security of the Indo-Pacific is inextricably linked to our own. On Tibet, the Chinese Communist Party's decades-long campaign to erase Tibetan culture, their religion, their identity, is a stain on the conscience of the international community. And, let's not forget that not that long ago, Tibet was an independent country. Nobody now refers to it as that. It is in effect been absorbed into China, and the Tibetan people have been slowly eradicated. I had the honour a few years ago of meeting the Dalai Lama in his exile home in Dharamsala. I do not share his religion, but he is an inspirational character, continuing to preach non-violence in the face of all of the threats and indeed genocides that the Tibetan people have faced. In Xinjiang, a number of other noble speakers have mentioned it, the situation is of course nothing short of a human rights disaster. The evidence of atrocities against the Uyghurs is overwhelming. Reports of mass detentions, forced labour, systematic surveillance and a form of cultural genocide do indeed paint a harrowing picture. In the South China Sea, China's aggressive militarisation, their territorial expansion, of course, violate international law. They threaten the free passage of goods that underpin global trade. And the UK has a vested interest in upholding freedom of navigation, and the Royal Navy's presence in the Indo-Pacific is a vital demonstration of that commitment to a free and open maritime order, and I hope that the government will continue to do that. Of course, my lords, I recognise that our relationship with China is complex. There are areas where engagement is, unfortunately, necessary, but engagement must not come at the expense of our values or of our security. We cannot allow ourselves to become overly dependent on a regime that routinely undermines the principles that we hold dear, and I agree with Lord Fox's comments on that. In concluding, my lords, I would ask the government the following questions. On Hong Kong, what further steps will the government take to hold China accountable for its breaches of the Sino-British Joint Declaration? And how will we continue to support those brave souls fighting for democracy in Hong Kong? On Taiwan, what is the government's strategy to support Taiwan in the face of the aggression that I just mentioned? And how are we working with allies to safeguard stability in the Indo-Pacific? On Xinjiang, will the government expand the Magnitsky sanctions to target more Chinese officials involved in the persecution of Uyghurs? And what efforts are being made to ensure that UK supply chains are free of forced labour from Xinjiang? On trade and investment, how does the government intend to balance economic engagement with China whilst helping to reduce our strategic vulnerabilities in many of the key sectors that noble lords have mentioned, like energy, like technology and like infrastructure? And finally, on security, what measures are being taken to counter Chinese espionage and interference in the UK, particularly in our university sector, in our research institutions and in our telecommunications networks? My lords, these are all pressing questions that demand clear and decisive answers. I hope the government will bear them in mind when they are pursuing their new reset of Chinese policies. The stakes are too high for ambiguity, and I urge the government to lead with the resolve and the moral clarity that the people of this nation expect and deserve.
My Lords, can I start by thanking and conveying my gratitude to the noble Lord Alton for securing this debate. I pay tribute to his work on China and as Vice Chair of the Hong Kong APPG and as a member of the APPG on the Uyghur people. And I thank all noble lords this afternoon on the last debate of 2024 for their insightful contributions. I think the quality of contributions has been, as you would expect, first class. Across the board, the government is clear that the UK, about our approach to China, that it means cooperating where we can on issues like, as Baroness Bennett said, like net zero, as some said, on health and also on trade, that we do compete where our interests differ, and I'll say a little bit more about that later, and that we challenge, and we have to challenge, where that is what we must do to protect our national security, as many lords have asked us to say, but also, as has been rightly raised, our values. As Lord Purvis indicated, we do need to reset and recalibrate our relationship with China, but also with the EU. and to be a full, active participant in the CPTPP. All of these things are closely interconnected. But what we also need is a relationship with China that is consistent, that is long-term, and that, yes, that is pragmatic, that is rooted in the UK and global interest. And as Lord Purvis also said, and suggested, that we need to be at all times clear-eyed about this, whether that's from stopping Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine or tackling climate change and the causes of climate change. There are times then we're going to be having to speak candidly and robustly, not just on areas of cooperation in the UK's national interest, but on areas of contention as well. Baroness Bennett made an important point that our concerns about Chinese state activity should not be interpreted as extending to the Chinese people themselves, and I thank her for doing that. As the world's second largest economy, our fourth largest trading partner, and a major economic power that is the largest driver of global growth this decade, we are not going to, and we shouldn't try to ignore China. So we must recognise that China, including Hong Kong, presents significant opportunities for growth that can benefit Britain and help other countries grow their economies right around the world. But in pursuit of these opportunities and a renewed partnership, we've got to be clear-sighted and honest, not shying away from difficult discussions over practices that harm the sort of secure and resilient growth that we want to see, and where our wider values do not align, that we make that absolutely clear. And in doing so, we've got to build a platform for a relationship that works squarely in our national interest, helping to grow our economy sustainably and making working people in every corner of Britain better off, while rightly putting our national security and resilience first, recognising that the UK-China relationship exists in an increasingly challenging and unstable geopolitical context. We recognise the importance of the UK's robust export control system and will continue to make sure that that has an impact. And we continue to use the powers we have through the National Security and Investment Act to scrutinise investments and other acquisitions, no matter where they come from, and intervene where that is what's needed to protect our national security. Of course, the UK and China share many interests, including helping the world achieve a just transition to green energy, as well as our economic links. Yet we have significant differences, including on our democratic values and freedoms, on Hong Kong, and on Russia's war in Ukraine, where Chinese companies continue to supply significant quantities of dual-use goods and components to Russia. So we've got to recognise that the UK and China by no means always agree, and as a responsible global player, we must engage frankly where we have different perspectives and cooperate where that's possible. That's why it was important for the Prime Minister to meet President Xi at the G20, the first leader to lead a meeting in 6 years, and it was right for the Foreign Secretary to visit China in October, and also for my colleague, the Minister for the Indo-Pacific, to visit Hong Kong last month. As you all know, we are examining the UK's interests with respect to China through the government's China audit to improve our understanding of the challenges and opportunities posed by China and meet them more effectively. I was asked about FIRS. The government, what I can say today is that we haven't yet made any decisions on which foreign power and foreign power controlled entities will be subject to the enhanced tier. The Foreign Influence Registration Scheme will further strengthen our national security whilst maintaining the UK as an international hub for business, and announcements will be made in due course. I knew I'd have to say that at some point today. Lord Ahmad asked about the China audit and whether I'd undertake to facilitate engagement of the House, and I'm very happy to do that at the appropriate time. And I'd just like to join Lord Ahmad and others in their calls for the removal of sanctions on parliamentarians These measures are wrong and they should end immediately. My Lords, we have a long shared history with Hong Kong, and like others, I have family links. My grandfather and my father lived there for a while the first airport was being built, and we have strong links between people and strong links on trade. I pay tribute to the work of Lord Alton and others over very many years, and we're now, as many have said, 40 years on from the signing of the joint declaration. We'll always stand up for the people of Hong Kong, and we remain committed to Hong Kong's future as an open, dynamic and vibrant city. Lord Garnier and others correctly highlighted the situation in Hong Kong. Like him, we are deeply concerned to see the erosion of the rights and freedoms of Hong Kongers following China's imposition of the national security law in 2020. Lord Alton asked me about the activists, and I can say the recent sentencing of the 45 pro-democracy activists is just another demonstration of the Hong Kong authorities' use of the national security law to criminalise political dissent. Those sentenced were exercising their right to freedom of speech, assembly and political participation. These rights are guaranteed under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of Basic Law. On Jimmy Lai, this case remains of deepest concern. Lord Alton, Lord Garnier, many others spoke movingly on his behalf, and I thank them for that. And he should be released. He's a British national. He stood up for freedom, and it is vital that it's a priority for the government. We raise it at every opportunity that we can. In response to Lord Callanan, the UK will of course continue to call on the Hong Kong authorities to end their politically motivated prosecution, and we will continue to seek consular access for Jimmy Lai, including to enable us to verify his health and his welfare. And I can assure noble lords that UK diplomats in Hong Kong continue to attend Mr Lai's court proceedings, and as they should. Lord Alton asked about British nationals named in the trial, and he's right to highlight this. All I can say is that attempts by foreign governments to coerce, to intimidate, through the mechanism of this trial, and to harm critics overseas are completely unacceptable, and just like the trial itself, they should stop. I share the concerns many speakers have raised on human rights in China. Across China, people face restrictions and violations of human rights and other fundamental freedoms. As the Bishop of Guildford explained powerfully in his speech, in Xinjiang, China continues to persecute and arbitrarily detain Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim minorities. We raise these concerns with the Chinese government when we can. Both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary raised human rights with their counterparts, President Xi and Foreign Minister Wang, and I'm glad that they have been able to have those meetings in order to raise those concerns. And I know that members opposite will say, but you haven't got a solution to this yet, nothing has changed. Well, I don't think that one single engagement gets you that. I think it's about consistency and continuing to raise and being firm in our beliefs and articulating those beliefs at every opportunity we get. The government conducts independent visits to areas of major concern whenever possible, and we're supporting NGOs in exposing and reacting to human rights violations. We'll continue to coordinate efforts with our international partners, which is why we joined Australia's statement on Xinjiang and Tibet on the 22nd of October at the UN General Assembly, and the US's statement on Xinjiang at the Human Rights Court on the 24th of September. Lord Callanan asked about sanctions. He will know what I'm about to say, which is that we don't comment on designations ahead of time for reasons that he will understand, but I thank him for raising that nonetheless. Lord Alton is right to raise the forced labour and our eradication of the use of forced labour in global supply chains. Baroness Smith, I thought, made a really thoughtful and well-informed speech about this. no company in the UK should have forced labour in its supply chain. It just shouldn't. And so at the moment, what the approach we're taking is that government's going to be working with businesses and international partners so that they properly understand what they need to do to combat forced labour, so that they have an impact in tackling this. We understand it's very well making statements, but actually what we want to see is the impact. So we're going to be working closely with business to make sure that we achieve that. And on Chinese student associations, I will commit to discussing this with the Security Minister at the earliest opportunity. On Tibet, my lords, as Lord Alton said, China's repression of the people of Tibet is utterly unacceptable, as they restrict freedom of religion or belief and the right to assemble and associate freely. The government stands firm on human rights, and we champion freedom of religion or belief for all. And we recently appointed our FORB envoy, and we wish him well in his work. But we champion this both in our bilateral relations with China and through the UN, G7 and other multilateral groups. My lords, on Taiwan, members of this House are familiar with recent tensions in the Taiwan Strait. Our long-standing position, and that of the previous government too, remains that this issue must be resolved peacefully by people on both sides of the strait, without the threat or the use of force or coercion. Peace and stability in the strait matters immensely, and not just for the UK, but for the wider world too. As we outlined in a statement in October, recent Chinese military exercises around Taiwan increase tensions and risk dangerous escalation. As Baroness de Souza correctly pointed out, and I thank her for the helpful suggestions in her speech, particularly on language training for officials, and I can assure her that that is happening. A conflict across the strait would be a tragedy for the people there, and it would be devastating for the wider global economy. I'm glad that Lord Alton reminded the House of a study by Bloomberg Economics at the start of 2024, which estimated that it could cost the global economy some $10 trillion, roughly 10% of global GDP. And that's why the UK does not support any unilateral attempt to change the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. And we've made our views on this clear to China. We're working with our partners to make sure they're doing the same. Baroness Smith raised a really interesting point about polar regions. China has an interest in natural resource exploitation. Increasingly, China is attempting to undermine existing protections and multilateral cooperation, such as through the Antarctic Treaty, in order to further their own interests. Their increasing use of the Northern Sea route as a transportation link poses threats to this pristine environment, and we think that there is a risk here if this is mishandled. Baroness de Souza, as I mentioned about language training, the South China Sea. In conversations with Chinese government during his visit to China in October, the Foreign Secretary set out the UK's concerns over China's aggressive activity in the South China Sea. The UK is committed to international law, to the primacy of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and to freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea. And we take no sides in sovereignty disputes, but we oppose any action that raises both tensions or the risk of miscalculation. Baroness de Souza and Lord Fox's speeches focused on technology, and I thought that was both interesting and quite sobering. We're going to continue to work on improving this country's cyber protections, and on critical minerals. I think it's a really important point. We will shortly be publishing a UK critical minerals strategy, because our energy security, frankly, depends on it, and it's the responsible thing to do. But I do take Lord Purvis's point, I think it's an important point, about we mustn't be seen to be lecturing partner nations on who they should and shouldn't be doing business with. We are a good partner when it comes to extractive industries. We work responsibly, environmentally, and with local workforce in country, and we would like to be more strategic in our thinking about this. So when that strategy is published, I do look forward to getting the response, particularly of Lord Fox, to what we have to say. But well, indeed, I think that was an invitation I didn't need to make. But my Lords, lastly, I'd just like to underline that this government's re-engagement with China aims to enable a consistent, long-term, pragmatic relationship through which we can pursue UK's interests on security and growth. We'll challenge and compete where that is the right thing to do and the smart thing to do, and we'll be ambitious on areas of cooperation. That's our duty, both to the British people and as a responsible global actor. And that's the heart of our commitment to re-engage, including through the long overdue leader-level meeting, the Foreign Secretary's successful visit to China, and the Minister for the Indo-Pacific's visit to Hong Kong. Indeed, in the new year, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, plans to visit China as well. And in all our engagement, from the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, where any escalation or deterioration in stability would have a significant impact on UK and global growth, to Hong Kong, to the completely unwarranted and unacceptable sanctions against UK parliamentarians and others, the Prime Minister has set us all clear direction. Cooperate with China wherever we can, take action to protect our interests, and at all times to stand up for our values.
My Lords, can I thank the Noble Baroness, Lady Chapman, the Minister, for both the content and the tone of the response to what has been, as she said, an outstanding debate. And in doing so, can I thank all Noble Lords who have participated today. But in parenthesis, might I also add the name of her noble friend, Lord Leong, who has sat patiently throughout the whole debate, and we know that because of other ministerial duties would not be able to speak, has had to take Trappist vows, but on other occasions has spoken most powerfully and eloquently on behalf of people in Hong Kong, and at the time the sanctions were imposed on his noble friend Lady Kennedy and on myself, he gave me enormous encouragement, and I've always been grateful to him for that. My Lords, many speakers have made the distinction between the Chinese Communist Party and the people of China. Nobody suffers more at the hands of the CCP than the Chinese people themselves. I often think about Tank Man, that man who in 1989, that solitary figure who stood in Tiananmen Square in front of the tanks as they rolled in. I think of Rahima Mahmood, who will be known to some noble lords here, particularly Lord Ahmed of Wimbledon, who is a Uyghur activist who speaks eloquently, powerfully, and whose own family have been intimidated and suffer through transnational repression as a result of the things that she has done. I think of Xinjiang, whom I mentioned in my opening remarks, and who was put in a prison in Wuhan because as a citizen journalist she went to try and find the origins of the COVID pandemic. And I think, of course, of my friend Jimmy Lai, mentioned by several noble lords, and who is standing trial in Hong Kong. One piece of evidence that was placed before the trial was that he once came to your lordship's house to have tea, which I gave him and his wife, as though this was some terrible subversive act. And I was grateful to the noble Baroness for mentioning people who he has never even met, and people he has met, including Luke de Pulford from the International Parliamentary Alliance on China, who have been named in these proceedings as co-conspirators. Bill Browder, who is known to many people here, has never met Jimmy Lai, but has also been mentioned in those proceedings. This is a sham and a charade, and it's right that this House has called that out. Let me say as well, as I come to a conclusion, that I know and understand the points about the importance of engaging with China on things like zero emissions. But 1/3 of all emissions come out of the People's Republic of China, and they have never kept to any of their targets, just as they didn't keep to the promises that were made 40 years ago today in the Sino-British Accord. I was struck that in 1979, when she negotiated with Deng Xiaoping about Hong Kong's future, Margaret Thatcher was told by Deng Xiaoping, "We could walk in and take the whole lot this afternoon," and in a characteristic reply, she said, "Yes, but the eyes of the world would now know what China is like." Well, that was true then, and it's true now, and that is the point of a place like this. It's the point of our democracy, for us to give voice to people who don't have a voice and to show that our eyes continue to remain on what is happening in China. My Lords, let me give the last word to the Joint Intelligence Committee, who said last year that China had penetrated, I quote, every sector of the UK economy in, quotes, whole-of-state assault, in which the government response has been, I quote, completely inadequate. Without swift, decisive actions, we face, I quote, a nightmare scenario where China could pose an existential threat. My Lords, Britain has a proud tradition of standing up to tyranny. I hope that we will continue to do that, and I know that all who have been present on this last day of this last session before Christmas and who have given up probably time with their families and friends to be here for that debate. Some have changed their travel arrangements to be here. I am particularly indebted to everyone who's participated, but I also know that the eyes of the world are on this British Parliament, but we do speak out when others are silent, and I know that notice will be taken of the eloquent speeches which have been made here today. All that remains now, my Lords, is for me to join others in wishing everyone present a very happy Christmas, also a peaceful and prosperous New Year, and to wait as the mace is now carried out, as we were reminded by the noble Lord Purvis earlier on by Mr Cameron Wood in his last act, before he now goes to what we hope will be a well-merited and wonderful retirement.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as of that opinion will say content. The contrary not content. The contents have it.
My Lords, may I, on behalf of my government whip's colleagues, wish every noble lord and clerks and doorkeepers a very Merry Christmas and a restful recess and a fabulous New Year. With that, my Lords, I beg to move that the House do now adjourn.
That the House do now adjourn, with thanks and best wishes to our mace carrier tonight, Mr Cameron Woods.